to first of all get a feel for this region and how unique it is in the sense that, man, there's a lot of peninsulas and islands, a lot of water there as well. So it's not like one big land mass like some of the other regions we've discussed. And also pay attention to what is just to the north of Southeast Asia, which of course is China. And pay attention to the Chinese influence in this region. Not only economically and in terms of trade, but also the fact that there's a lot of Chinese who have emigrated into Southeast Asia. So think about that as far as the continued connection between a population in Southeast Asia and their home country of China. Also, of course, keep in mind, with all this Chinese influence, the interests and role of the United States in this region. So a lot to think about in this chapter. Okay, so on this slide, they're immediately hitting us with some jargon. So hopefully you're familiar with the term archipelago. Archipelago is essentially a chain of islands, and Indonesia is a good example of an archipelago. If you think about the Aleutian Islands, the island chain off of Alaska, that's another archipelago. It's just a chain of islands. A couple of other geography terms that you may want to be familiar with is peninsula, because they're going to talk about the Malay Peninsula. A peninsula is a body of land that's surrounded on three sides by water. And also, you may want to be familiar with isthmus, which is a narrow strip of land that is essentially surrounded on two sides by water. So there's an isthmus in Thailand, and very similar to what essentially Central America is. Central America is an isthmus that connects North America to South America. Okay, so Southeast Asia's physical geography has both risk and reward in the sense that a lot of these islands are volcanic islands. They're where oceanic plates are subducting beneath continental crust and producing these island chains. So of course that seems like a downside because of course you're going to have volcanoes erupting, you're going to have earthquakes, you're going to have tsunamis, but it also has given rise to very rich and fertile soils on some of these islands as well, so it helps with agriculture. One exception to this ring of fire thing is the island of Borneo, which is not a volcanic island. It's actually, it was uplifted and has been eroded away. And it turns out this is actually a great sanctuary for plant and animal species. Part of the reason being the soil is just not that great, so there's not as much of a temptation toward farming the interior of Borneo. But there is still, just by population pressure, some intrusion into this island sanctuary by loggers and farmers and such. Appreciate the fact that when we're dealing with so many islands, think about how climate change, sea level rise, sea level fall could allow for little land bridges to form, which would allow for the migration of species from one island to the other. Palm oil plantations and deforestation. This is becoming a very lucrative crop, partly because oil palms yield more oil per acre, per hectare, than some of the other crops such as soybeans and sunflowers. Okay, notice that Southeast Asia falls within the tropics. The tropics being officially defined as being 23 degrees north of the equator, which is the Tropic of Cancer, and 23 degrees south of the equator, which is the Tropic of Capricorn. So certainly the Southeast Asia region falls within the tropics. Therefore, it's tropical. Therefore, it means a lot of rainfall. So we're not really talking about any desert regions here. A lot of rainfall, ample moisture, plenty of rivers. In fact, rivers that sometimes get too much moisture, so you have flooding issues. But these rivers have become important transportation vehicles for people and for goods. Also, of course, in more modern times, rivers become have the potential for producing electricity. Of course, that's always a problem. Everyone lives downstream, and any country that builds a hydroelectric dam can affect the flow downstream as far as the transport of sediment and nutrients, as well as perhaps affecting the fishing further downstream. Perhaps the best known of the rivers of this region is the Mekong, which starts in China, has its headwaters in China, and then creates the boundary between several countries in Southeast Asia before emptying out into the Mekong Delta region in Vietnam. This is an interesting video that features the methods that the Thai army is using to combat poppy growers in the Golden Triangle region. What should strike you is the amount of red on one of the islands, and that's actually the Indonesian island of Java. Formerly pronounced and spelled J-A-V-A, now written J-A-W-A. It's this one right here. Primarily, the folks who live there are of Indonesian descent. But you also notice all the different colors here, indicating the different ethnic groups that are identified in Southeast Asia. In addition to the indigenous ethnic groups, we can't forget about the fact that there are immigrants from outside the realm, from South Asia, from India, as well as from China. And in fact, the immigrants from China are in significant numbers in some locations. As I mentioned at the top of the chapter notes here, even though we're studying Southeast Asia, in which China is not a part of the region, yet it has a huge influence. And part of the influence is former Chinese that are now living in Southeast Asia. In fact, Chinese make up about 80% of the total population of Singapore and about 26% of Malaysia. Okay, so this little animation allows you to essentially paint Southeast Asia using the ethnic colors that are displayed in figure 10A4 of page 520 in your textbook. Just like there is no one single ethnicity, there's no one single culture that defines Southeast Asia. Similarly, there's no one single religion. As is mentioned in your book, 90% of the people in Indonesia, nearly 90% of the population in Indonesia are Muslim, but in Myanmar and Thailand and Cambodia, Buddhism is supreme, and more than 90% of the people there are adherents. And as you'll learn in, say, the Philippines, Roman Catholicism predominates. How the European colonial powers moved into this Southeast Asia region and essentially divvied it up amongst the British, the French, the Dutch, the Netherlands, and the Spanish, which is no small feat considering, again, these are rather fragmented territories. A lot of these are island states, and so there was a challenge of essentially creating manageable territories and essentially enforcing borders that had not been there before. Okay, so one of the questions might be, well, what is the appeal? Why were these European colonial powers interested in this region? Well, one of the reasons is spices. In the era, as mentioned in the book, before refrigeration, spices were really, really important in order to make foods are more flavorful. So the spice trade became a big factor, and just generally world trade in general, especially as more and more commerce occurred over the sea. Um, Other countries became players in this region, including the United States, in the 20th century, as the United States wrested control of the Philippines away from the Spanish. Okay, a couple of points to ponder as you look at the colonial spheres of influence in Southeast Asia. What kinds of impact would European colonization have had on this region? And finally, which areas do you believe would have more European imprints, and which areas would have less, and why? Of course, after the colonial period, many of these nations have got their independence, and some of them are really emerging markets, quite often following in the paths or the steps of Japan and China. Of course, the crown jewel of these emerging markets, or the real heart of Southeast Asia's economic development, is Singapore, the city-state of Singapore, which for its size, you wouldn't think would have that much of a worldwide impact, but because of its wonderful port and its relative location, has become a huge economic powerhouse and has a huge per capita income. The old saying is that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that's the idea behind a lot of trade organizations, regional trade organizations, among which is ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's a way of developing agreements in trade, not only among the various countries in the region, but also to negotiate trade deals outside the region with the rest of the world. As you'll read, several of these several of the nations in Southeast Asia are seeking to create greater relationships with the United States, and part of that is geopolitical. Large part of that is geopolitical, in the sense that they want to have a check and a balance to the amount of Chinese influence that is being asserted in this part of the world. Okay, the section on states and boundaries, which essentially goes from pages 531 through the end of the chapter, essentially makes the point that boundaries are just arbitrary human conventions, and quite often they arise because of physiography, because a river or a mountain chain essentially cordons off one part of a landmass from another. Quite often you can have ethnocultural, just certain groups of people lived in a certain location, and so you can use that as a dividing line. And sometimes they're strictly geometric, where quite often in the case of colonies, just to divvy up the land, it was done very geometrically. Gives examples of various types of states. So, for example, Cambodia is described as a compact state because it's quite, in this case, sort of circular. And that's good in the sense that it means that there's very little border for the amount of land area. So you're not having to defend a huge border. The next example is Thailand, which is what's called a protruded state, in the sense that it's got this little kind of tail dangling off. And again, that's a lot of border to defend for not much area. Vietnam is a similar elongated state, in the sense that it's just kind of, whereas Thailand has a big kind of top and a very small bottom, Vietnam is essentially just kind of stretched latitudinally. So it's got, again, a lot of border to defend. Fragmented states, in this case, is like the Philippines is an example of a fragmented state, in the sense that there are just so many islands that make up the Philippines. And then finally, a perforated state, which there is no real good example in Southeast Asia. So South Africa is used, where you have Lesotho, an independent state within a state. Okay, so note how this map makes the distinction between insular Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia. The difference being that insular, this inside section here, doesn't have any land boundaries with any other region. That's not true of mainland Southeast Asia, because notice that it borders both the East Asian realm as well as the South Asian realm. And notice there's also a transition area. So even though Papua is part of Indonesia, it is also part of this larger island that includes Papua New Guinea, which is not in the Southeast Asian region. So mainland Southeast Asia is made up of 5 countries: Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar, which formerly was known as Burma. To most Americans, of course, we think about Vietnam. Vietnam was the country that the U.S. was involved in a war from the early 60s into the mid-70s. And part of the intervention of America into this region was the concern that communism would spread throughout this mainland Southeast Asia region. Vietnam, since the war, has transitioned and has actually become a fairly fast-growing economy, largely because it has set up special economic zones based on the Chinese model. And there's actually a fairly good relationship now between the U.S. and Vietnam, partly in Vietnam's case, because, again, the desire to have a counterweight to the Chinese influence in this region. The different types of boundaries were discussed, and Cambodia was used as an example of a compact type of boundary, or compact nation, which you would think would lead to some stability because it doesn't have that much of a border to defend compared to the size of the nation itself. So compact usually is a good thing. Unfortunately, Cambodia has a long, bloody history, particularly the Khmer Rouge regime. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look up the movie The Killing Fields, which gives details about what life was like during that time period. Even though Southeast Asia is growing economically, Laos is lagging behind the rest of the region, partly because it's got a relatively small population, only 6.8 million people, partly because its government is slow to open up its economy, partly because it's landlocked, doesn't have good trade routes currently, and also it's been hobbled by its involvement in the drug trade. It is part of that golden triangle that was detailed in the video a little bit earlier this chapter. Okay, contrasting Laos, now we have Thailand. Thailand is the leader in economic development in the mainland area. It's got the largest city, Bangkok, which now recall from chapter 10a, remember those different boundaries, those different borders. Thailand was used as an example of a protruded border, or a protruded nation, in the sense that it's got such a large northern part and then a very, very small, skinny section down to the southern part. Where it gets skinny, it borders with Malaysia, and it's essentially just a porous border. There's no physical barrier between Malaysia and Thailand through that area. And there's a difference in the population as well in the southern part. Unlike the rest of the nation, the Muslims predominate in the southern frontier. So again, we have a great contrast. Remember, we had Vietnam, which is economically on the upswing, and then we had Laos, which is not very effective economically. Thailand, the most vigorous economy in the mainland region. Now we're in Myanmar, formerly Burma, which again was under an oppressive government for a military dictatorship for a long time, and only recently has come out of that and is lagging behind the rest of the region. One thing that it does have on its as an upside is a large coastline offering trade opportunities in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so now we move on to the insular portion of Southeast Asia, different than the mainland. In fact, it's kind of hard to imagine trying to piece all these different pieces of islands all together, but if you combine them all, it would actually make up a larger area than the mainland. Now, this insular region consists of 6 states, as well as a city-state and a sultanate. Okay, so we start our study of insular Southeast Asia with the country of Malaysia, which is actually split up into 2 parts. It's got a mainland part, the southern part of the peninsula of the mainland, and then it also has an island part, the island of Borneo. It shares with Indonesia. So there's actually a West Malaysia and an East Malaysia. The West Malaysia, as you'll note, has also its home, or at the very end of it, is the city-state Singapore. And another important feature is this Strait of Malacca, a very important shipping route between Indonesia and Malaysia. And the island part of Malaysia, the East Malaysia part, one thing that's very interesting about it is that even though it makes up about 60% of overall Malaysia's territory, it's home to only about 20% of the population. So quite often East Malaysians sort of look at themselves sort of like colonies. They don't feel like they have the same amount of representation in the overall Malaysian government as West Malaysia has. Of course, also included in East Malaysia is the Sultanate of Brunei. Okay, so at the tip of Malaysia, there is the city-state of Singapore. And again, as mentioned before, this is a economic powerhouse. The GDP per capita in Singapore is like over $51,000 compared to neighboring Malaysia, which only has a GDP per capita of a little over $10,000. All right, why the success? Because of its good location and its port. It's essentially a port city, and that allows a lot of commerce to be done in Singapore. They're also trying, there's current development strategy, first of all, to branch out a little bit, to diversify the economy by focusing on IT and automation and biotechnology. And they're also trying to forge an ever stronger growth triangle with 2 of the developing neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia. Both of those economies are on the rise. Okay, there's that word, archipelago, this chain of islands that makes up Indonesia. Indonesia is the 4th most populous nation in the world, and it's spread out, of course, over a huge number of islands. There are 5 major islands, one of them being Jawa, which has by far the predominant number of people in it. Sumatra was affected negatively by the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, which is the capital of Indonesia. Sometimes it's called the Kolkata of Southeast Asia. It is a big city, over 10 million people, and yet it has no metro transit system, which is pretty amazing. They're actually constructing one, but it is both home to tremendous wealth and crippling poverty. Obviously, a challenge for Indonesia is the control of the territory. The fact that it is so spread out over all those islands, inevitably you're going to have centrifugal forces at play, quite often from cultural and religious differences. There was a policy of transmigration where the government was trying to move some of the population off of that main island, Jawa, to some of the outer islands. However, it was a failed practice. About East Timor, which was the most recently independent nation in this region, and read about the international intrigue, why Australia is so interested in the East Timor fight for independence. I encourage you to check out this video about East Timor, first of all, to get a feel for its natural beauty, and also to get a feel for the challenge then of being a new nation and developing the infrastructure which will allow it to have tourists, but also the challenge to not destroy the natural beauty that the tourists are coming for. Okay, not unlike Indonesia, the Philippines is a relatively fragmented country. And I learned a little bit more about the Philippines as my sister-in-law is from the Philippines. She's actually from the island of Mindanao. There's the main island of Luzon to the north, and to the south there's the island of Mindanao. While for the most part the country is Roman Catholic because of the long-standing Spanish influence, there is a bit of discord and insurgency due to the Muslim population in the country. The one thing that is very important for the Philippines, at one time it was a U.S. territory, it was given its independence, and there are now growing relations with the United States, again, as a counterweight to the Chinese influence in this region. Okay, this is a nice little animation which gives you the chance to play a game and identify the different countries in Southeast Asia. This activity is not only a map matching activity where you get a chance to match some of the major cities or place several cities, major cities in Southeast Asia on the map of Southeast Asia, but you also get a chance to match the names with different pictures of the cities. A couple things to think about. Consider natural resources, population, infrastructure, relative location, and international relationships. What factors have assisted the economic growth and development of countries such as Singapore and Thailand? Another question to think about is, what factors will be important in the future economic development of countries such as Vietnam and the Philippines? And finally, what could hinder economic growth and development in this realm?